Next installment, Luther's internal critique of Erasmus and his On the Bondage of the Will. We're looking at specifically Luther's internal critique and his use of Erasmus's arguments against himself. The next one here, Luther deals with the issue of free will, which is more free choice. That, by the way, the Latin word arbitrio for will has in it the idea of to arbitrate or arbitrary in the English language. And to arbitrate would have in the idea of a judgment or a choice being made independent of other factors. Arbitrary can kind of sometimes mean random, but it means really uninfluenced. And so that's kind of the idea rather than the Latin word voluntas. And so that is what Erasmus is talking about and Luther is arguing against, is this idea that there is an independent, autonomous human will that can be separate from God as the creator, that can be separate from sin, and that it can will and choose God and the things that pertain to eternal salvation. That's what Luther's arguing against. And in this argument, he makes the point that this would be a logical impossibility because it would be an uncaused cause. And sometimes people try to use that as an argument for God. It is true that every cause has an effect. Every effect has to have a prior cause or causes. However, you don't have the effect of a free will choosing the things pertaining to eternal salvation just independently out of nowhere, is Luther's point. But he says, but not contented with this, he outstrips even the philosophers, for it has never yet been settled among them whether or not anything can give motion to itself. But according to Erasmus, free will not only of its own power gives motion to itself, but applies itself to those things which are eternal, that is, which are incomprehensible to itself. A new and unheard of definer of free will truly leaves the philosophers, the Pelagians, the sophists, and all the rest of them far behind him. Nor is this all. He does not even spare himself, but dissents from and militates against himself, more than against all the rest together. For he said before, the human will is utterly ineffective without grace, unless perhaps this was only said in joke. But here, where he gives a serious definition, he says the human will, that power by which it can effectively apply itself to those things which pertain unto eternal salvation, that is, which are incomparably beyond that power. So that in this part, Erasmus outstrips even himself. What he's saying is with these mutually exclusive and contradictory definitions of free will, Erasmus shows his position to be false. And so goes on to say, for you said that free will is a power of the human will by which a man can apply himself unto good. Whereas here you say and approve the saying that man without grace cannot will good. Meaning, is will the operative matter in this issue? Is it that the will can do things of itself, or is it that it cannot do things of itself without grace? And if it cannot do things of itself without grace, then what is the point of identifying it as the unique feature in salvation? He goes on and says, the definition therefore affirms what its example denies. Great statement. He says, and hence there are found in your free will both a yea and a nay. And you're saying yes and no at the same time. You're affirming and denying something at the same time. So that in one and the same doctrine and article, you approve and condemn us, and approve and condemn yourself. For do you think that to apply itself to those things which pertain to eternal salvation, which power your definition assigns to free will, is not to do good, when, if there were so much good in free will that it could apply itself unto good, it would have no need of grace? Therefore, the free will which you define is one, and the free will which you defend is another. Hence, then, Erasmus, outstripping all others, has two free wills, and they militating against each other. So Luther's claiming here that Erasmus has laid out the definition of free will, but what he defends is not the definition. So therefore, he has two mutually contradictory definitions of free will. Luther alleges that his first free will is a power of human will by which a man can independently apply himself unto good. Definition number two is that man without grace cannot will good. What are the independent and dependent variables? So Luther summarized this point as, you approve and condemn us, meaning you say you're disagreeing with us, but you're agreeing with us and disagreeing with us, and you're agreeing with and disagreeing with yourself. Logically, Erasmus had to choose one or the other position, but in attempting to choose both, destroys what he affirms. So the argument is not sufficient to sustain its own claims. It's also the problem of free will versus enslaved will. Section 43. He goes on, section 48. He goes on and says, but setting aside that free will, which the definition defines, let us consider that which the opinion proposes contrary to it. Let's set aside the problem of definitions. Let's look at the example. He says, you grant that man, without special grace, cannot will good. For we are not now discussing what the grace of God can do, but what man can do without grace. You grant, then, that free will cannot will good. This is nothing else but granting that it cannot, quote, apply itself to those things which pertain unto eternal salvation, according to the tune of your definition. Nay, you say a little before, quote, that the human will after sin is so depraved that having lost its liberty, freedom, it is compelled to serve sin and cannot recall itself to a better state. Now then, I believe my Proteus has here no way of escape. He is caught and held fast in plain words, quote, that the will, having lost its liberty, is tied and bound a slave to sin. O noble free will, which, having lost its liberty, is declared by Erasmus himself to be the slave of sin. When Luther asserted this, nothing was ever heard of so absurd, nothing was more useless than that paradox should be proclaimed abroad, so much so that even a diatribe must be written against him. And so Luther makes the argument that when talking about free will, we are examining what it is that free will, this alleged idea of free will, this concept is in and of itself. That is without God's grace. And in and of itself, independent of God and his grace, and with sin, it is depraved. So man cannot will good, even on that definition. But now we add sin into the mix, and this so-called free will is the slave of sin. That will is tied to the nature. And that's Luther's really main argument. Luther also nails Erasmus on the neutrality fallacy. That Erasmus tries to argue for an autonomous will that is neither on the side of God nor on the side of Satan or sin. But neutrality, by definition, is a self-defeating position. Because if neutrality is correct, is the correct position, then we should abandon our original position for the correct position of neutrality. But if neutrality is not the correct position, we should not assume it, and we should not leave our original position. So it's to be rejected. It's itself a self-defeating idea. But having shown the inconsistency and contradiction of Erasmus's definitions of free will, Luther then focuses on a possible claim of a middle point between the two definitions. Maybe there's a middle position between what the free will that can both simultaneously will good and not will good. In other words, is it possible that free will is neutral, not necessarily willing good or bad? And so this is how Luther answered. He says, but perhaps the diatribe is dreaming of this, that between the two can will good and cannot will good, there may be a medium, seeing that to will is absolute, both in respect of good and evil. So Luther says, okay, well, maybe the position will adjust to say, okay, that in between willing good and willing evil, there's just willing. And so Luther says, okay, this would be kind of the next logical position if one wanted to continue to defend this free will as Erasmus has described it. Maybe we don't need to put it in a binary of that the will wills good and that the will cannot will good, because that's a contradiction. But maybe there's a subtler version of this, that the will just is. It doesn't necessarily go one direction or the other, toward evil or good necessarily. But Luther goes on, says, being without grace, possibly free will, does not immediately will nothing but evil, but is a sort of mere abstracted willing, meaning just willing in the pure sense, veritable upwards unto good by grace and downwards to evil by sin, meaning will is kind of in the middle. It can be influenced by grace, it can be influenced by sin. Maybe there's a middle position here that could be legitimate. But Luther shows by Erasmus's own words that when sin is part of the equation, the will must be in bondage to sin. Therefore, the will is not free. He says, in a word, which way soever the diatribe turns itself, it cannot keep clear of inconsistencies and contradictory assertions. Meaning, the arguments of the diatribe of Erasmus's work cannot avoid contradictions. It's a self-defeating view, according to Luther. He says, nor avoid making that very free will which it defends as much a bond captive as it is a bond captive itself. For in attempting to liberate free will, it is so entangled that it is bound together with free will in bonds indissoluble, meaning free will, now Erasmus has just acknowledged, is enslaved and in bondage. And how can something be free that is simultaneously in bondage? Now, it may feel free, but Luther says that it is not. So he goes on and says, moreover, it is a mere logical figment that in man there is a medium, a mere willing, this idea of willing. Nor can they who assert this prove it, even if it did exist. It says, it arose from an ignorance of things and an observance of terms. Whereas the matter rather stands as Christ saith, he that is not with me is against me. So there is a binary there. There's not a neutral standpoint according to Christ. Matthew 12:30. He does not say, he that is not with me is yet not against me, but in the medium. For if God be in us, Satan is from us, and it is present with us to do evil only. Or if God is in us, Satan is from us, and it is present with us to will nothing but good. That's the nature. The nature determines the will. But if God be not in us, Satan is in us, and it is present with us to will evil only. Neither God nor Satan admit of a mere abstracted willing in us. But as you yourself rightly said, when our liberty is lost, we are compelled to serve sin. That is, we will sin and evil. We speak sin and evil. We do sin and evil. So in dealing with Erasmus's arguments for free will, Luther claims that Erasmus's arguments for free will are actually arguments against it, and arguments against Luther are actually arguments for Luther. It says, behold then, invincible and all-powerful truth has driven the witless diatribe to that dilemma, and so turned its wisdom into foolishness. And whereas its design was to speak against me, it is compelled to speak for me against itself. Though the whole diatribe itself is nothing else but a notable effort of free will, condemning by defending and defending by condemning. That is, being a twofold fool, while it would appear to be wise. Luther referred to this situation as the argument being stabbed by its own sword. The scripture sets forth man as bound in sin and dead, among other descriptions, even though he believes he is free, happy, at liberty, powerful, whole, and alive. And in making these arguments, the diatribe, quote from Luther, says, asserts and proves more than it ever intended and argues against itself.